Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. We want to talk to you tonight about near-death experiences, and we have with us a renowned author, Lynn Monet. She has written 5 books, and she'll be talking about near-death experiences. And I'm just going to kind of turn it over to her. And I'd like everybody to leave their cameras off, if you would, please, because some of the people that we have on have low bandwidth and they're on their cell phones, and we may lose them if we don't keep the cameras off and the sound off. If you have questions, just post it in the chat sessions, and I'll pass it on to Lynn, and we'll get your questions answered. So, Lynn, if you would go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start in. I'll ask you a couple of questions to get us started on near-death experiences.
Okay, first of all, thank you so very much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this. I have been a nurse for over 30 years. I've actually been a nurse for 40 years, and about 17 years of that has been in end-of-life care. I also have a degree in biological science. I have the ability of second sight. I have had these gifts ever since I was a little girl. Where I grew up, we were 3 short blocks behind a hospital that had at the time they were called nursing homes. Now they're called skilled facilities right next door. And then there were Indian mounds on the opposite side of the hospital. So it was very commonplace for my sister and my brother and I to see dead people walking through the house. It was like, oh, well, there's a clock, there's a door, there's a dead person. And they would show up in patient gowns, or we would see people in Indian costumes. And the thing that was the most memorable experience, the very first that I really, really remember very strongly, that I can remember like it was yesterday, is my brother and I, we were in my parents' master bedroom. And of course, at 5 years, I was 5 years old, my brother was 7. And I was in my mother's jewelry box decorating myself, and my brother was on the floor playing with his cars. And all of a sudden I turned to show my brother how glamorous I had made myself with all of my mother's jewelry dangling on me. And he was literally fixated on the corner in the room. So I looked to see what he was looking at. And there was this misting, which since of course I've learned is called ectoplasm. And it was forming in the wall corner. And all of a sudden we see my brother's best friend, John, his mother, father, and brother stepping in to the ectoplasm, which turned out to be a portal. And they're standing there and they're just smiling at us. So my brother gets up and he runs out the door. I run out behind him, and we both go in opposite directions looking for my mother. And my brother finds her first, of course. So she of course is coming to the room. My brother's telling her, oh, mom, John and his family's here. And she's like, well, I didn't even hear anybody knock. So she's rushing, and he's like, well, they're in your bedroom. And she's like, they're in my bedroom. Who let them in my bedroom? So they ended up going into the bedroom, and of course nothing was there. My brother got in trouble for it. And of course I kept my mouth shut because I didn't want to get in trouble too, even though we both saw it at the same time. And the very next day was the first day after spring break. It was a Monday. My brother got on the bus. He used to sit with his best friend, John, and they'd ride to school, and John wasn't there. And when he got to the classroom, he also shared a side-by-side desk that connected with John. And again, John was absent. And after they said the Pledge of Allegiance, the teacher stood up in front of the class and stated that John would not be returning to school because he and his entire family had perished in an auto accident coming home from Disney World or Busch Gardens or wherever it was in Florida that they were coming from. And it happened that day. It happened the day that my brother and I saw John and his family in the corner of my parents' bedroom. So it all started that way. I grew up as Presbyterian. My mother took a jaunt with the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is a book within itself, but we won't go there. So at about 10 years old, I was still seeing things and talking about seeing things, but because my mother had incorporated the Jehovah's Witness religion in, she took me in front of the elders at 10 years old, and I was petrified, having to stand in front of all of these men. They were telling me that there was something wrong with me, that I was possessed, that what I was seeing was demons, that I was going to die in Armageddon. And I became so afraid of my gifts that I also, that I would still see things and I would run out of the room just as fast as anybody else. Woo, there's a ghost. And so it wasn't until later in life that I purchased a house as a single mother that was so haunted. It had legitimately 2 demons and a man that had hung himself in the house. That being exposed to that and trying to get assistance with that, I was able to talk to people of like mind who also helped me to acknowledge my gifts and to nurture them, because now I'm speaking to people of like mind, and I did realize that I wasn't so much of a weirdo. So anyway, again, the house was so haunted, I never moved in there. So going forward as a nurse, I've been a nurse, as I had mentioned, for many, many years, and 17 years of that has been in end-of-life care. I've been able to see hundreds of people pass away, and I've seen them take their last breath. I've been there, throughout their period of time of them getting ready to cross over. And because I have the gift of second sight, I actually see them when they leave their body. And something that I'd like to say about that is that a lot of times when people pass away, they'll start talking about things like, so-and-so, if something happens to me, will you please take my cat? They also, sometimes they stay embodied until the last minute. And there are other times that they choose to leave earlier, even days earlier sometimes. And then the body goes ahead and finishes itself, the physical parts of it. But as an example, my mother, before she passed away, she was going around the facility that she was at, and she was telling everybody goodbye, and that she was going to go home to heaven tomorrow. And sure enough, she did. She left just shortly after 1:00 in the afternoon. She passed over, but she was going around telling everyone that she was going home the next day. And she even told a lady whose dog had been put down recently that she would help watch the dog for her in heaven until the lady could come and retrieve the dog herself. And yes, animals do go to heaven. You do get to see your animals again. It usually comes in the second session of the reception. There are 3 different kinds of death. There is a natural death, which most of us have. There's sudden death, and there's also near-death experience, and they're all handled differently. On the other side, there is a grand reception for the natural death. The near-death experience, they don't do that because a lot of times the death happens as a shock. They're not aware of it, and having all of these people coming forward with this grand reception would be a little bit overwhelming for somebody if they're trying to still bargain with God to crawl back in their body for one more breath so that they can go home and take their kids' lunchbox to them at school or something like that. And then the near-death experience, as I had mentioned, is also very different. So anyway, in the case of natural death, which is what my mother had, the reason why I say that sometimes they leave their bodies earlier and some decide to stay in later is because my mother was one that chose to stay in until the last minute. And this was obvious because she was no longer able to verbalize and open her eyes. But when people would come into the room, she would move her mouth and her eyebrows up and down in reaction to whatever was being said, and it was appropriate. They'd come into the room and say, "Hi, Phyllis," and she'd in response. And the thing about people when they're getting ready to pass is that they have filters that start to efface so that they're able to hear the telepathy coming in from the spiritual side, as well as they can still hear the people that are embodied souls on this side talking. And it creates a very interesting situation because a lot of times the part of death that people miss is when their loved one is in that transitioning state where they can hear the telepathy as well as the human conversation, that a lot of times you can talk to people on the other side and get responses through the patient that is dying. And I have an example of this. I had a patient, her name was Edna, and she had only been on my unit for about 2 weeks. And her son and daughter come to my nurse's station and they say, Mom's talking to people in the room that aren't there. Well, I kind of expected that because loved ones do come forward. There's also a galactic element to it too, where it's all connected, so everybody's right, and I'll share that as well. So to comfort them, I knew she was fine, but to comfort them, they were concerned. I said, well, let me walk down to your mama's room with you and see if there's anything that she needs to make her more comfortable. So we went down to Edna's room, and Edna's, of course, laying at a slant, and she's smiling and she's reaching up into the sky as if she's being handed something very, very delicate, like a snowflake, something that she was very pleased to be receiving, but yet she was trying to be very, very careful with it. And I said to Edna, Edna, who's here? And she said, George. And her daughter turned as white as a sheet and had to sit down. And she said, well, George is my father, and my father passed away X amount of years ago, and that's my father's name. And then Edna piped up and she said, and he's glad that you're taking care of Pixie. Pixie was Edna's poodle. When George passed away, Edna's poodle, the son took possession of Edna's poodle. The poodle was still very much alive, an elderly dog, but still very much alive. And the son had Pixie, and the son told me that story. And so he said to me, he said, do you think my mom's hallucinating? And I couldn't come out and just say, well, no, I don't think she's hallucinating. I think that your father's here to help her cross over. And so I turned it back around and I said, well, do you think she's hallucinating? And he said, well, I don't know. And I said, do you mind if I try something? I'm not trying to change your belief system. I'm not trying to, push any of my beliefs on you, but I do believe that loved ones do come in to collect their loved ones at their time of crossing over. And, do you mind if I try something? And he said, no. And I said, Edna, can I ask George a question? And she nodded her head yes. And I said, now keep in mind, the one thing that I didn't mention about Edna is Edna had been blind for 10 years. Totally, totally blind. She couldn't see shadows. She couldn't see anything. So keeping in mind that Edna is totally blind, I asked Edna what color her son's shirt was, and she said yellow. He was wearing a yellow Ralph Lauren polo shirt. And the only way that she could have known that is if George had told her that the color of the shirt was yellow. So in that moment, the son got it. He's like, oh, hi, Dad. He was kind of happy with the idea that the father was there, and I gracefully exited the room. And I have so many examples like that.
We have a question from chat. One of the people in chat wanted to know if you could explain what a portal was.
Portals are openings into other dimensions. As we live on the third dimension, heaven or home or whatever you prefer to call it is on the fifth dimension. The fourth one is kind of a gray area. There are veils between each of the dimensions, and the portals are areas that you can transfer in and out of other dimensions into other dimensions. And portals also, that's from a light note, but there are also portals that can be man-made and created that are accumulations of man-made consciousness of fighting and anger and behaviors that are a little unsavory, that create sometimes these shadow figures that look like ovoid platforms with fluttering skirts on them, almost like a manta ray going over furniture and things in the house. They can look like snakes slithering across the floor. They can also be silhouettes of people. And a lot of times they continue to get larger and larger if they're in a very negative atmosphere where negative things are going on. And once they mature, they become portals for entities to enter in on that are not exactly friendly. And also portals can be opened by the use of Ouija boards, for instance. I personally would torch all of them, but I know that there are some people that have had enough experience with those that they know what they're doing. But a child has to be 16 to get a driver's license. Most states 21 to have a drink, but you can give an 8-year-old a Barbie Ouija board and they can open up portals allowing demons in from the other side and unsavory spirits in from the other side at age 7. So, there's more to the Ouija board, and that only people with experience should be using those. Personally, I don't care for them. But portals can be created by people, and portals are also, even things with other beings such as the skunk ape, or what Bigfoot you want to call him, also uses portals interdimensionally in order to, I believe, to travel around where they go and to also disappear instantly, stink and all. When they get cornered somewhere and a dog comes up or something like that with people, and all of a sudden they're gone. There's no way that they could just disappear smelling all like that, unless they are entering in and out of portals.
Absolutely. That's the only way they could completely disappear.
That's right.
Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your book, so that if somebody in the audience would like to get one, how they can get one, and enough about the book that they can decide whether they'd like to get it or not.
Okay. Omnipresent is my first book. It's the story that is based on the house that I purchased as a single mother with the 2 demons and the young man, excuse me, in the house, that I was haunted so badly that I never moved in. That's how bad it was. 2 nights, that was enough for me. I was out. But that book series is going to be a 5-book series. The Omnipresent is out. Omnipresent What Happened Next is out. Omnipresent 111 Beckdon Drive it is finished and completed. It's just going through one more process, and that will also be posted on my www.lynnmonet.com page. I've also written the book The Colors of Heaven, which is the one that I'm talking about, seeing people leave their bodies at the time of death and crossing over, as well as my mother's crossing is in there, which is very beautiful. It brings a lot of comfort to people that either have lost a loved one or have been diagnosed with a terminal illness. They are all 5-star rated books. In addition to that, just to back up a little bit, in the series, the 111 Beckdon Drive, everybody wanted to know what happened next. So it talks about how I got a hold of the family who sold me the house and what happened to them. And it goes into other stories that way, and some ways to determine whether you have a problem in your house or not. Most people automatically assume when they have an entity in their home that it's a demon. And 99.5% of the time, it's not. It's something else. It could be a poltergeist or a disembodied soul. Poltergeists are different than demons, but it can be something different. In addition to that, The Colors of Heaven, like I said, is a beautiful story about the act of dying, the death part itself, what happens physically as well as spiritually, and what happens afterwards, and the different kinds of death. Then I wrote a book called The Gap. I had a late life baby at 46, so I'm 60, and I've got a 15-year-old at home. And I was looking for a book with a more modern theme, with all of, they tell them about the birds and the bees, but they don't tell them some of the other stuff, like what to do if a condom breaks, or going out on a date with stinky sneakers, because there's nothing attractive about a handsome guy or a handsome girl. A good-looking, pretty girl, if their shoes stink and you're closed in the car with them. So it gives them some good guidelines on healthy boundaries, what healthy boundaries are, good choices in friends, what to say, for instance. And then the 5th book that is going to be coming out that I'm working on now is Omnipresent, Gnome Place Like Home. So, and that has to do with a house that I recently inherited it with my sister's death, that had an elemental living on the property that's created havoc and also holding spirits on that property. And again, you can get a hold of me at www.lynnmonet.com. Some of my books are out on Amazon. However, if you get them through my website, I'm able to sign them for you and personalize them. They cost the same, and plus, Amazon will sometimes they don't pay the, I mean, they like to keep a major portion of what they're getting. So, and I don't charge that much anyway. And I'd like to think if you were going to pay for the book that you'd want it to go to the author anyway, even though it's really not about the money. I just want the word to get out there, but you can find it in either place, whatever you're comfortable with.
We have a question from chat. They wanted to know what a death angel was. Are you familiar with a death angel?
You know, they call it a death angel, and a lot of times people will see what they expect to see or what they've learned. Also, the loved ones that come forward, they always look pretty very recognizable the way that you've seen them before, the last time that you have seen them. So if you expect and anticipate to see a death angel, you are going to see a death angel. You don't always see a death angel, but you do see angels, and they're beautiful. And when I was mentioning the galactic part of it, when my mother passed away, the room was filled with loved ones, and she had already exited her body, and she's standing there, and they're coming up and greeting her. But the thing about it is there were these other beings, and you know, you have to consider that we are made of energy and water. We have a synapse in our heart that every time it beats under a microscope, it sparks. So we are electric and water. And the thing is that when we shed our bodies, because we don't die, we just shed our bodies, and our energy has to go somewhere. Now, keeping in mind, you know, energy can't be created or destroyed if you want to take it from a scientific side of it instead of a spiritual side of it. However, there are so many sunshines that are sunshine. Well, there's so many stars, I mean, that are sunshines for other solar systems that it would be ignorant to think that we're the only ones. There are other planets around those solar systems with life on them that when those energetic beings finish their cycle where they're at, they also have to go someplace. So there are beings that I have seen more than once on the other side that don't appear to be from here, but they are of the level of angels. They walk with the angels. They are magnificent, beautiful, very, very tall, luminous hair, gorgeous, gorgeous. I don't even, you can't even really tell whether they're male or female, not that it matters. They're just gorgeous. And the energy is so positive, but they are of the level of an angel. So maybe they're some kind of a master, but they have a different appearance than we do here. And that's why I'm saying galactically and spiritually, that's where the two combine. So everybody's right.
All right. A question that I have for you here is, what are the different types of near-death experiences, or are there different types?
You know, it's the way that the person, with the near-death experience, sometimes people talk about going up through a tunnel, as my father did. I had a near-death experience, and I didn't really go through the tunnel. I just kind of went straight up through the clouds and could see the beautiful blue sky beyond. But I was sent back before I finished it. Some people end up like in a pasture, and they end up greeting thing. And the thing about the near-death experiences is a lot of times, most of the time, they're not reunited with their loved ones because they're going to be sent back. A lot of times they're given the option to be sent back or not. And I'm not saying that they never get to be reunited with their loved ones, but there's this huge grand reception with people from many lifetimes and your animals from many lifetimes. So just don't expect your cat and dog to come up. You may have had an ostrich, you know, in another lifetime, or an elephant. They come bounding up too. So, yeah, I hope that answers that.
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
I tell you what, Bubba wants to come on and tell a near-death experience he has, and I guess he wants to share that with you so that maybe he can get some input from you, or what your feelings are. Bubba, you want to come on?
Hi, John. Don't worry, I'm Bubba Haley.
Hi, Bubba. It's nice to meet
I
you.
Good to meet you. And I grew up in radio and TV. And I had a morning show for like 50 years, 40 years. And so I had an hour every day in the morning where we just let the listeners call in and ask their questions. And I had special guests, as of like yourself. And so one person called in and said, "Bubba, why don't you do a story, a talk show on near death experience?" I said, "That sounds interesting. Okay, thank you." So I thought about it, I prayed about it, and I realized at that moment I wasn't ready for that. And so I started calling book authors as yourself and putting them on the air. And then I had some people that had near death experience. And so they said, we have a meeting once a month where people that had near death experiences would get together and, just talk, you know. And they invited me there. And it was in Houston. And so I said, I'll be there. So I went there and there was candles and, quiet music and, it was serene. And so they asked me, do I have any questions? I said, oh, I'm loaded with them. And I said, so what did each one of you see? Well, there was common denominators between everybody that was there. It was all about seeing a light, going through a tunnel. Not all of them, because we're
Mhm.
like snowflakes. No two are the same.
That's
So
true.
you're judged differently, or you're loved differently,
Right. But there are
and
some similarities.
all
Yeah.
God's angels. Yeah, yeah, and all God's angels come in disguise, and I believe we're all angels on earth.
Hmm.
There's one little sentence that you could say that's going to change a person's life or lift them up. And so, anyway, they were talking about, light and beauty, and you were mentioning colors. They said there ain't colors in heaven or whatever dimension universe they were in that you couldn't find in your crayon box.
That's
They said
very,
there
very
is
true.
none. And
That's very, very true. Yes. And
and
I've
then
seen it myself.
also, yeah, it's not a color. You can go to Home Depot or Lowe's and, look at those little color palettes, and there's none of those people saw those colors. It's a totally different world. There's
It
that
is.
song by Mercy Me, I Can Only Imagine. You
Mhm.
can't imagine. It's
No, you
heaven.
can't. And
You know,
the thing
you,
about the
you can't
colors too.
you can't
Oh, I'm
go there.
sorry. Yeah, that's true. The thing about the
Go ahead,
colors
go ahead.
too
I'm good.
is they're not just colors. When you connect with the colors, there's a energetic life about the colors. They literally are living colors, and you connect with their frequency and their vibrations. So they're so vibrant. I mean, the feeling of the elation and all of the love that comes from the other side that you feel when you're in the presence of the angels, and when you are on that other side, there is no earthly feeling that can touch that. There are no words that can even describe it. But I totally concur with what you're saying. I'm sorry I interrupted, but I was getting excited because you were talking about stuff that I've seen myself.
Yeah, and I believe that we all see different things. Some see their life; they float above their body in an operating room, and they can
That was
tell
my
the
dad.
doctors exactly what happened.
Yes.
And everybody's different, but there's all similarities to every
Mm-hmm.
near death experience somehow or another. And it's a love that can't even be comprehended. You can't put it into words because
Mm-hmm.
it just surrounds you and enthralls you, and the caring and the love that is there. And to me, that's God.
Yes.
That's, you can't deny that. And if one
Mm-hmm.
person said they had a near death experience, well, we're all going to question them or say they're crazy. But when thousands, hundreds of thousands around the world, say they've had that experience, you can't discount that.
No, you can't.
You can't just omit that.
Yeah. My new favorite color
And
is actually on the other side.
I remember one time a friend of mine who's an entertainer, a musician, and I was on the radio and I was about to get off, and he was coming from out of state, and he goes, "Bubba, will you go with me?" And I said, "Where we going?" And he says, "My mom's dying at the hospital." And I said, "Well, you know where the radio station is. Just pull in here, pick me up, we'll go." So we went down there, and he's filling me in about her mother. And so when we walked into the room, nobody was in there, and she was staring up in the corner of the hospital room, and
I've
there
seen
was
that.
nothing there.
Oh, yes, there was.
And then so he went over on the right side and held her hand. I went around on her left side and held her hand. She ain't blinked. She ain't looked at us. She didn't acknowledge her son or me, and she knew me. And so she just kept looking. And her son is saying, Mom, it's your son. I love you, and things like that. She didn't respond. And then she kept staring, and I just was in just total prayer. I just was I didn't know. I never been around that. And we were holding her hand, and all of a sudden she rolled her head over and looked at me and says, "Bubba, do you see that?" And then put her head back up in that corner. And I believe now you can call it a death angel, you can call it, whoever, but you can call it a loved one, whatever. But she was being welcomed home, and she was a good Christian woman. She was a believer. So, do you have those experiences, or when you talk to people that's had life after life, near death experience, whatever you want to call it, that see those same things? And is there a consistency to that? And what is your story? What was your near death experience?
There is, as a matter of fact, and I just want to preface this for everybody. I have seen atheists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Presbyterians, Lutherans, you name it. I've seen them pass, and they all cross over if they choose to. The only ones that do not cross over, they have that freedom of choice, are people that choose to stay earthbound. Of course, those are usually the ones that are haunting your house and shaking your bed in the middle of the night. And they have reasons for that too. But the ones that have crossed over, it is not religiously denominated. So I wanted to, everybody thinks that you have to be a certain faith, and I've seen a lot of them cross over. I've had people, my own experience, I had surgery. I remember going up through, there was like a round opening over my head that I went up to, and they stopped me at one point because they said, it's not your time, and they sent me back. So I didn't get to see that, but I've gotten to see a lot when people themselves have passed away. And my father had a near-death experience where he was in the hospital, rolled over, looking at his body, saw the crash carts coming in. He continued up. He was in the tunnel. He talked about seeing my deceased sister briefly. She wasn't able to communicate with him because he wasn't picking up the telepathy at that point. And then he was given the choice to either stay or not. And of course, when you leave your body, for one thing, you do keep all of your senses. You can see, smell, and hear, so you can still talk to them the same way that you and I are talking. People dispute the smell part, but it's not a smell like with an olfactory nerve, like with a nose. It's a memory recall type of smell for them, is how they do that. But I've had so many patients that have talked about seeing angels and loved ones coming forward even as much as a year beforehand, and the medical field considers it hallucinations, and it's not hallucinations. And I have an example that I'd like to share if you would like me to.
Please do. Please do.
Okay. I had a patient named Abigail who came in with her husband to the facility that I was working in. They had come in for the levels of care for him because his health was declining. And it just so happened that she then slipped and fractured her hip and she ended up on my unit. I was working midnights on the weekends and I came in and she was upset. And she had been on my unit long enough that we built up a rapport. So she said to me, she said, Lynn, she said, do you think that I'm crazy? And of course I'm teasing her because I'm like, I couldn't imagine why she would ask me that question. So I said to her, I said, well, define crazy. And of course she's like, no, I mean like crazy. And I'm like, well, no, of course not. Why would you even say something like that? And she told me, she said, I see my parents. She said, my parents have been dead for X amount of years, but they come and they visit me and it makes me happy. She said, and now the doctor's going to order medication for hallucinations for me because I'm seeing my parents and I don't want to stop seeing my parents. And I told her, I said, well, first of all, I've heard that you were going to be discharged in the morning. And as your advocate, you are of sound mind, you can refuse to take the medication if you don't want to. So she was happy with that and she went home the next day. But then about 6 months later, she came back to my unit and her health was declining. She had ended up with cancer and she was on the unit. And there was one day in particular that I was working a day shift for a friend of mine instead of the night shift. Now, Abigail had started talking about now, in addition to seeing her parents, seeing a woman with a little girl that would come to her room. And this was so real to her that she would be sneaking cookies and cakes from the dining room back to her room to share with the little girl and her guests. So this, of course, was creating a bug problem. We had to put a stop to that. But this day that I was working my shift, I was walking down the hallway, and I'm abbreviating this because I know that we have limited time. But I was walking down the hallway with my treatment card after the residents had been placed back in their rooms after their lunch. And I'm passing Abigail's room on this side, and I notice that she's sitting in a recliner and she's leaning forward with a piece of yellow butterscotch wrapped candy. And there was this big air conditioner underneath the window right next to her. And it looked like she was trying to feed the air conditioner. Anybody else that would have walked by, that's what it would have looked like. But I saw standing in front of her this woman and this little girl. And I'm like, oh, well, great. Abigail's got some visitors today. I mean, she had no children. She was an only child, so she never had visitors. It was just her and her husband. So I was thrilled to see that she had visitors today. And I could see these two people. The woman had long, dark black hair parted down the middle. She had on a denim skirt and a white peasant blouse. The little girl standing in front of her, again, black hair, bangs, little Mary Jane shoes, a blue pinafore style dress, very cute. But then I walked forward and I went about 3 steps past her door. And I realized in that moment that I had not seen those people sign in at the nurse's station. So, and of course, legally, we have to have a head count so that if there's a fire or an emergency, that the firemen know how many souls are in the building so that they can head count and make sure they get everybody out. So I stepped back and I knocked on her door frame and she invited me in. And when I walked in, there was nobody there. But I knew what I had just seen, and I could see the energetic waffling, which the way that I see spirits is I can see them as clearly as I can see a human out of my peripheral vision, right down to how their hair is styled and what color they have on. When they're in front of me at a distance, they have an opaque appearance, kind of like the reflection in a plate glass window. Like when you see yourself walking up into a JCPenney or something and your reflection, it looks like that to me. And when they're standing right immediately next to me, it's a energetic waffling to the air, like gas fumes or like the vapors off of a hot road, that waffling effect. So I'm standing there and I can see this waffling effect. So I know that they're still there. And Abigail says to me, she says, I want you to meet my friends. Isn't the little girl beautiful? And I said, yes. And she immediately couldn't believe it. Her eyes got huge. And she said to me, can you see them? And I said, yes. And she said, don't tell anybody. because they'll put you on medication. They'll think you're crazy and put you on medication. So here this woman had the wherewithal to she was still seeing spirits because her time was coming close. She could still see the spirits. She knew the difference. She had the wherewithal to know the difference. And the medication wasn't taking away the hallucinations because they weren't hallucinations. And then she actually ended up passing very shortly after that. But I have had so many examples of people in the hospital, even with Alzheimer's, that have noticed the loved ones collecting other loved ones. And I'd be happy to share a story about that too.
Go ahead.
Okay. I had a patient named Shirley. She had been in the facility for I worked there 10 years. So she was there about 7 years. The last 3 years that she was there, she did not speak one word. And I remember when she was up walking around talking to people, but she was now tooling around in a wheelchair and hadn't spoken a word, like I said, in 3 years. And I'm coming on shift and she's pulling up in front of the nurse's station. I'm like, oh, well, there's Shirley. I'm like, hi, Shirley. And of course she didn't acknowledge me. And I go back to pull my charts and to get ready to do my med pass. And all of a sudden I hear this woman screaming, take me home, please, please take me home. And so I come out of the nurse's station. I'm looking down both hallways, wondering who the woman is that's calling out. And I assumed when it stopped that somebody had assisted her, a CNA or another nurse had assisted whoever it was. So I turn around to go back into the nurse's station. And before I can even get all the way back there, I hear again, take me home, please, please take me home. And I turn around and it's Shirley. It was Shirley calling out. And it just so happened where she was sitting in front of the nurse's station, the direction that she was facing in, the very first door on the right, there was a woman in that room that was actively passing. I mean, she was within hours of passing. So I walked over to Shirley and I'm stroking the inside of her arm. And I said, Miss Shirley, I said, who are you calling to take you home? And she said, look at the angels. Aren't they beautiful? And she's pointing down the hallway in the direction of that woman's room. And sure enough, I can kind of turn off the second vision thing, but I looked, and of course, at first I didn't see anything. So I looked again and I could see the loved ones and the angels literally bulging out through the wall into the hallway of this woman's room. And Shirley was seeing that. Shirley then passed away herself about 3 months later. But when they get closer to their time, they can also see them, and they do start talking about them as well. So, and also I've had patients to talk about things when they're during that state of transition, where they're going in and out, where they're, like you go into a room and a person, sometimes their eyes are half opened and it looks like the lights are on, but nobody's home. Their toes are kind of flaccid, and then all of a sudden their toes will perk and their eyes will brighten up and they'll start talking. And this is called what we call rallying in the medical field. And it's where they're transitioning, actually testing the dimensions and that sort of thing. But I've actually had a patient. Her niece was named April. And I was in the room with April and the patient, and I hear April's aunt saying to her, which is my patient, April, when are you gonna have those 2 baby girls? I want to see those 2 baby girls before I go home to Jesus. And April turns around and she says to her, she says, well, her aunt, she said, I can't have children. She said, I've been trying for 25 years to have children. She says, and I'm 45 and I'm in menopause, but I don't know why you're seeing children. It's a nice thought, but I don't have any children. And her aunt insisted. She said, no, these are your children. You're holding one in each arm. They're 2 blonde-haired girls with ringlet. She said, ringlet hair and chocolate brown eyes and dimples. And they look like you. So the aunt ended up passing away. About 6 months later, throughout the time that I was there, April's uncle then went through my unit with a hip replacement, and he was there temporarily. And her father went through and passed away on the unit across from mine. So I got to see her 2 additional times coming into the facility. So 6 months later, I see her come into the facility and she's got a baby bump. And of course, I couldn't resist. So I kind of rush over and I'm like, you hiding a little something there? And she said, I am pregnant with 2 identical twin girls. It turned out that she was pregnant with the girls before her aunt passed away, but she didn't know it. It was very early pregnancy. But the aunt was visiting with the little girls on the other side and came back and told April about them. And lo and behold, I got to see the little girls 2 other times, once after they were born. And sure enough, they were blonde and brown-eyed and dimpled and looked just like the mom. And they had curly hair. So I got to see them when they were toddling, and of course, when they were a little bit smaller than that. So I got to see that, and the description was exact. And I've had many people that are going back and forth, and they come back and they tell somebody something, or that ends up, working out. I even had one patient come back and tell her brother, you need to go get checked out. Your stomach, there's something with your stomach that you need to get checked out. And sure enough, he had the beginning of stomach cancer in his stomach, and they caught it early enough. So, and I found that out too, because her brother was actually an employee where I was working. So that's how I found that out. But there is a process that occurs with people that they do see, and when they do cross over, there is a huge reception for them, with the exception of, like I said, they don't bring it on with the near-death experience or the sudden death, which is the other type of death, which usually the spirit has to come to the point where they accept the fact that they have died in order, then that reception comes on. But they have to go through a few things first before that happens, so that it's not overwhelming for them. But I had mentioned too that there are sometimes spirits that choose not to cross over. And I had an example of that also on my unit. I had a patient that was actively passing, and I'm standing in front of this woman's room getting some medication for her. And I can see with my second sight, this man, there was a sitting area with pillars, and he was peering around the pillar. And I'm like, hi there. I'm like, why haven't you crossed over? And eventually he kind of worked his way over to my cart. And I said to him, why haven't you crossed over? I mean, this lady's getting ready to pass. Her loved ones are here, because they will come around even though they're lost souls out of curiosity. And I said to him, I can hook you up. You can, go with this lady, which he didn't need that. But he ended up telling me he was, he looked to be about 30, 35 years old, handsome man too. He had a very heavy Irish brogue, and he was dressed in clothes that were like upper middle class, not rich, but not middle class. He was well dressed, and you could see that he had the appearance of Swiss cheese to his abdomen area, which to me indicates that he died of some kind of a corrosive disease like cirrhosis of the liver or cancer. And so I said to him, well, I can help you cross over. I said, this is a one-time deal, because most of the time if people could see you, they'd run off wetting their pants screaming. I said, and I can help you cross over if you want to. And he said, me lady, I can't cross over. And I'm like, well, oh, sure you can. Why can't you cross over? And he said, because my wife and my mistress are on the other side, and neither one knew about the other. So this guy had chosen to stay earthbound because he didn't want to cross over and have to face the music of being confronted by his mistress or his wife. So there are oftentimes many different kinds of reasons of why they choose to stay earthbound. Some, addictive, sometimes addiction will do it. Sometimes they're caring for a loved one that they expect to cross over before they actually do, and they kind of linger, or for a pet or a child, and then they get stuck here. But, there are a lot of reasons that they don't.
Do you have any experience with someone that had a near-death experience that caused them a disturbance where they needed help because of the experience?
Well, it wasn't so much in the sense of a disturbance. My father, when he went up through the tunnel, my father was a severe alcoholic. He was a very, very angry man. He was not nice, very intelligent. But because he was an angry drunk, it made it very difficult for my mother and my family growing up. Me growing up, my family growing up, he was physically violent. When he had his life, because they allowed him to have portions of his life review, which you do, you do have a life review. You do go to the Akashic or Akashic records, however you say it, pecan. So, and the neat thing about it is he talked about when he came back how there are cubbies on the walls, and some of them have veils over them, which are missed opportunities. So he shared some things with me, but what he was saying, what he reviewed of the way that he had treated people, when he returned, he immediately stopped drinking. Stone cold, stopped, never picked it up again. And he became such a humble, dear man. And he made amends. He came to my mother and apologized and said, I'm sorry I wasn't the husband that you deserved to have and that I hurt you. He came to me and I'm so sorry. I did the best that I could as a parent. And I know that I didn't do all of the things that I should have. And I'm sorry. He couldn't do anything but apologize at that point, but it turned his life around. It was the last 10 years of his life. He was a completely different person, totally different. So, and if he had continued on that path, it would not have been a good thing. So I hope that's what you mean by your question.
That's one of the things I was asking, yeah, because I know that it is a traumatic experience. Any experience that you have is traumatic to some degree, and for some people, this can be an awful shock, especially somebody that's agnostic or something, So I'm sure that would have a profound effect on them.
Well, they definitely have their moment of an oh my goodness moment. So
come to Jesus meeting, huh?
Yes, they do. They do. As a matter of fact, somebody was saying, somebody that was channeling that comedian, I don't want to say Carson. No, he was the blonde-haired fellow with the ponytail. Anyway, he was atheist. And they said that when they were channeling him that he had his oh crap moment, but it wasn't like an oh crap, it was a no. Can I say shit? Well, he says no shit, because here now he sees the angels and all of that everybody was right, and that there is such a thing, that there is that afterlife. So I have only in my life seen one person fight death for 10 days, and I don't know what came in to get him when he did finally take his last breath, because I wasn't there that day, but I can tell you what, it wasn't the same. There weren't loved ones coming in to collect him and help him to transition and get comfortable with crossing over. Not one. And normally you'll see that even days in advance. So I don't know what came in to get him, but maybe he didn't cross over. He might still be wandering the earth.
He might be. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. Danny had a story she wanted to share with us, but I think, Danny, if you don't mind, we'll wait and share that at another time. I'm going to end on that note. I hope everybody has a good evening. We'll talk to you all later, and we'll catch you next Sunday. For those of you that might want to know about it, if you'll check my Facebook page tomorrow, I'm going to be on a podcast tomorrow night on Paranormal Connections. And I'll share that link with you all on my Facebook page. I'll go ahead and close out tonight. Let me go ahead and stop the recordings.